It's good to be back. And first of all, let me start with wishing you Merry Christmas wherever you are. Frankly speaking, I'll be surprised if you get to listen to this episode tonight because I'm assuming most of you would be celebrating Christmas and probably listen to this show maybe tomorrow or a few days later. And that's fine. But just in case if you're listening to the show tonight, don't worry. We are still going to stick to the same theme of Christmas, and more broadly speaking, it's about Christianity. If you've been a listener of this show for a long time, then you would know that we frequently talk about classical texts, and a lot of time we venture into the arena of religions, different religions during different times of the year. And I thought it'll be a great opportunity to talk about Christianity today. And for that reason, I picked a wonderful book called Mere Christianity, written by the great Christian philosopher and thinker C.S. Lewis. I don't think we have had a bigger figure than him when it comes to this topic in the last 100 or 150 years. And this work called Mere Christianity, it's monumental. He presents the kind of arguments which you don't usually find in the everyday discourse when people talk about religion and in particular Christianity. So that's something I found really interesting. Plus, I liked the way he approached the subject. For example, when a lot of people they talk about religion or they talk about Christianity, they begin their case by following different ways. Some of them present scientific evidence in favor of, existence of God. Some talk about their personal mystical experiences, or some just directly appeal to the authority of whatever written in their sacred or religious book. But that's not the path C.S. Lewis chooses. What he does is, instead he goes to talk about the human behavior, the very things that we experience and understand in our everyday life. And he begins that discussion at a more fundamental level. And he brings in the theological or the elements of belief in God and all that details later. But first of all, philosophically, with open mind, if you understand his arguments, it's going to be a very interesting read for you. And I'll give you a very interesting and brief overview of this book and different arguments that he comes up with. And I'll try to explain those ideas in as much detail as possible. But still, I would still say that once you listen to this podcast, please go and read this book. Whether you are an atheist or a believer, come from Christianity or different other religions, it's going to be really helpful for you when it comes to discussions on any religion and especially Christianity. So, with that in mind, let me start with the discussion on book, what it says and the kind of argument it makes. So first of all, C.S. Lewis claims something very interesting. He says that there is a fundamental law of human nature. Now, what do we mean by that? He says that we have this strange instinct within us that guides us in all our everyday experiences in terms of what is right and what is wrong. For example, when you are traveling and you're not feeling well, you have an injury in your leg, let's say, then you can ask your co-passengers, and let's say you haven't found a comfortable seat, you can ask somebody, can you give me that seat? Now, why do you think the other person would help you? What are you exactly appealing to? What is this exact sentiment we are talking about here? And he gives numerous examples first. You know, when we go and we make a mistake, we step on somebody, then we apologize. We're always appealing to some kind of ideal human behavior. And it transcends cultures, time, and societies. Why does it happen? And C.S. Lewis himself um, talks about the criticism that can come with this kind of argument. So he says that you can argue that this is a herd instinct, that it comes from, as a um, as a species that you've evolved. You want to stay friendly with the members of others with the same species, and you're behaving accordingly. But he then argues that there is something different about the herd instinct. Because let's say a lot of people are killing somebody or beating somebody in a mob. Even then, they or you realize that's wrong. How do you know that's wrong? So this kind of higher morality that we already have this sense of right or wrong. This is what he is trying to discuss here. So in that sense, he says it's a law. It's not something that a mere social convention. So if you see it in that frame of reference, it's very similar to in the Eastern or Hindu philosophy that you find the idea of dharma. The dharma is not the idea of religion, but the underlying code of righteousness. And I think the belief is quite similar in the Hindu philosophy that there is this universal code of right and wrong. And every human being has that capacity to understand that. You can do whatever you want, you can be fair and unfair in your dealings. But the point here is you will always have that sense of right and wrong. You'll feel guilty, you'll feel content with your actions. When you cheat, you'll feel a certain way. When you do honest work, you feel in a certain way. And quite often you are driven by this law, no matter how much you try to resist it, whether it's a social convention or not. Whichever society you're put into, you'll always have that notion of right and wrong, of understanding that fundamental human nature. And at this point, I think Lewis takes a huge step, and when he starts talking about a little bit of theology, or at least theological arguments, and that's where I think the discussion gets really interesting. He poses this question, and the question is fundamentally about the human nature and the human nature of human, this law that he's talking about. Where does that come from? And for that, he asks us to question, where does the universe come from? And how did this come to be? So it provides us two explanations. One is the materialistic view, and the other is the religious view. The materialist view, he says that the matter and space there are, and they just happen to exist. They've always existed. Maybe they didn't exist at some point. We don't know. We don't know why they exist. And I don't think science can answer that question of why something exists. We can get to the scientific causes and in terms of material dimensions, we can talk about that. But the why of it, the reasoning, I don't think the materialist view can give us that answer. In fact, the materialist view will consider this question rather innocuous and not really honest. The religious view, on the other hand, he says, is that what is behind this universe is more like mind, like the human mind. And it created this universe partly for purposes we don't know, partly we do know. But the important thing to understand here is throughout history, at least in the recorded history, you'll find that these two views have contested against each other. Whether you see in the Eastern tradition of Hinduism versus Buddhism, in the Western tradition when the Enlightenment happened, or even before that, there's always been question about the existence of God, about our role in the universe, what are we doing here, how did the universe come to be. So there have been these two different approaches. One has been the religious answer, and one has been the more materialistic answer. Now, as I said, when we go into these kind of philosophical discussions, we understand that science probably is not going to answer some of these questions, at least not now, because science fundamentally works by experiments, by observing how things behave, and then by making inferences based upon those observations. So what happens is science cannot answer questions concerning anything which ask the question why anything exists at all. Why am I here? What am I doing? What's the purpose of my life? Why is the universe as it is? So that's the limit of science. And he makes a really, really interesting point here, which I found very impressive. He asserts that there's only one thing, and only one thing in the whole universe which we know, probably more than we could learn from any observation, and that is a human being, and especially ourselves, your own mind. You can know, understand, be with, and actually see. So you can only be sure of whatever knowledge system, whatever information we talk about. You can only be sure as long as it applies directly to you. And then he makes this argument that whatever you want to understand about the universe, just start with yourself. And that's a very spiritual idea in a way, that you understand yourself. You forget the political reasonings in another country, or all the knowledge that is out there, but just observe your simple behavior, understand yourself, and then you'll find the same things that he's talking about here, that we find ourselves under a moral law, and we can't really fabricate it, we cannot really forget it, and we know that we have to behave or act according to this law. And that's in spite of our cultural differences, our social conventions. We understand this law very deeply. Now, so far so good. So far it looks harmless, and a lot of atheists would also agree to some extent to this discussion that it's fine. We understand ourselves, we go to the spiritual path, and we pursue knowledge by understanding ourselves better, right? But the problem sometimes comes, and that is something that Lewis touches upon, is when it goes to the religion, and people get a little careful when we have that discussion, because a lot of people might say that world has tried religion, and it hasn't really worked. In fact, it took us back to dark ages and made the world a whole lot worse, and nothing good really came out of it, right? So to that he makes some interesting arguments. So he makes this claim that when you look at the present state of the world, and remember he was writing in 1943 when the World War was going on, when the Holocaust was going on. So what he asserted at that point, that humanity has gone wrong. We have to turn the clock back. We have to progress, at least in the terms of morality, in terms of our behavior. We need to progress, and that's why we need to make this change. But then again, why bring religion into this? He argues, continuing the same idea, that okay, we have understood that there is a moral law within us. There is something, some kind of force, if there is, behind this universe, behind each one of us. Then we need to conclude that whoever the creator or the force behind that is a great artist, because the universe is definitely a really beautiful place. And at the same time, he says that force is quite merciless. It's not a friend of human beings, as sometimes people claim these days, whether from the religious or spiritual circles, that God is all loving and quite merciful. On the other hand, Lewis claims that no, bad things happen here and the God is nasty at times. I'm sorry to use the word God here, but eventually, of course, he's getting to that point, but he doesn't really uses that term at this point. What he instead says is that whatever that moral force, or whoever has put that moral law in us, is not really interested in just mercy, but he's interested in right conduct, in fair play, in courage, in good faith, in goodness, in honesty. So he's good, but not in the sense of being soft or sympathetic or indulgent. No. He is only good in the sense that he strictly wants goodness to prevail here. So then he goes one step further. I think he's hinting at talking about personal God, or is this some kind of impersonal force that is behind all this, which can be interpreted in terms of just pure nature. Evolution happens, nature takes over, and it just happens, right? That's the scientific view here. So instead of this argument, what Lewis says is that if this force, that moral force we are talking about, if it is purely impersonal mind, then there is no use in asking it to make allowances for us or to let us off. Why would it do that if it is impersonal? And similarly, if it is an impersonal absolute goodness, it would be foolish to conclude that if you went against it, if you did not like it, then there's not going to be any problem, right? So that's where he brings the concept of personal God. And I think before I talk about that, I should talk about the dilemma that he mentions in his work. He says that on the one hand, we are on his side. By his side, I mean God's side. We are on his side and really agree with his disapproval of human greed and trickery and exploitation. We know at bottom that unless the power behind the world really and unalterably detests that sort of behavior, then he cannot be really good. If the universe is not ruled by an absolute goodness, then all of our efforts are hopeless. But on the other hand, then, we know that if there is an absolute goodness, it must hate most of what we do. And if so, we are making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day. So our case is hopeless again. He is our only possible ally, and we have made ourselves his enemies. So that's the puzzle that he talks about here, which which is really kind of paradoxical if you think about it, especially when you enter that sphere of religion and you start believing in it. And I think to some readers, I think a lot of readers who don't believe, it might not make sense, this argument, when he makes that leap, going from the moral order to these claims of personal God. And that's quite true. I agree with that. I think Christianity won't make sense until one has faced the same sort of challenges that Lewis is addressing. If you have faced those challenges, if you have faced those philosophical conundrums, then you will probably better understand Christianity or any other religion for that matter. In fact, you can clearly infer from this reading that what he's trying to say here is that Christianity only speaks to a person who understands and who's probably realized that there is a moral law and there is a power behind that law. And he has broken the law and put himself wrong with that power. So person who's already is feeling kind of guilty, is kind of, thinking that is made a mistake and is repenting that. And that's where I think that's the kind of psychology that Christianity addresses a lot of times. In fact, when you read Friedrich Nietzsche, that's the kind of criticism he comes up when it comes to Christianity. He says that it's more of a slave's point of view, that they were rebelling against the elites, and that's the kind of slave morality, he uses the term, that is there in the Christianity. And it can be seen either way. If you're Nietzsche, you see it probably in some kind of negative light. If you're C.S. Lewis, you see it in the positive light. You see the benefits that you can get from it, and you probably see the truth in it as well. And then in one of the chapters, he talks about something interesting. He talks about different religions, different forms of belief in God, and one by one, he criticizes each one of them, the different beliefs. So he starts with pantheism, which is at least how he explains it. He says that in pantheism, what happens is God animates the universe. He is what gives it life and substance. So in that sense, the universe almost is God. So that if it didn't exist, God wouldn't exist. It's just the creation itself is the creator. That's the kind of non-dualism I think you'll find in India also. That there is just no light. There is this ultimate Brahman in Hindu philosophy. There is no such boundary between the creator and its creation. So what happens in that is anything you find in the universe is a part of God, and also the consequence of that is also reflected in the morality of that belief system, because God is beyond good and evil in that case. Everything is good in one way and bad in another, sort of like yin and yang. That's pantheism. Then now we get to monotheism, which is mostly, or rather in almost all cases, no, practices dualism. So what happens here is, in this belief system, God invented and made the universe, and God is definitely good and righteous. He takes sides, he loves certain things, he hates certain things, and God wants us, in this case, because God is personal, he wants us to behave in a certain way and not take certain actions. So that's the second view, is more the Christian view, which is that God made the world, God conceived and created all things, but he is very separate from them, from his creations. And I think when it comes to pantheism, he criticizes with the same points that I discussed earlier, with the paradoxes that come up with, and but when it comes to distinguishing different uh, dualist philosophies and in fact criticizing dualism as a whole, the points are subtler and they must be read carefully. So for example, a lot of believers grapple with this question that atheists always pose, that if God is all good, all just, righteous, then why there is so much suffering in the universe? Why does this happen? And here is what I find interesting about C.S. Lewis. He makes you think. He comes up with answers and explanations which you probably would have missed. And he doesn't like really simple, straightforward explanations. And this is something he talks, he says when he talks about atheism, he says it's just too simple. If there's no God and the universe has no meaning, that's fine. It's just, there's nothing in it. It doesn't look like reality. And similarly, criticizes certain belief in Christianity, for example, Christianity and water. Finds that notion that this good God in heaven and everything is okay. You do certain things, you go there. That's easily done. That idea also he kind of criticizes. He finds that reality is twisted and very interesting if you explore it carefully. So where he says that Christianity differs from other dualist philosophies, is that normally in dualism what you find is there are two equal and independent powers. One is good, one is bad. And what happens is, in this universe which becomes battlefield, these two opposing powers, they carry on with their endless power. In Christianity, however, he says, the point is there is a good world and that has gone wrong, but the world still retains the memory of the good and what it ought to have been. And that's the challenge Christianity poses for human beings. And then, of course, there's the argument of free will, which you'll find everywhere when it comes to the defense of religion, and especially when atheists raise this question that why there is so much wrong, why do we do wrong things if God is behind our actions? Because it's a very simple argument to make, because it's quite straightforward that God gave you free will, and once you have free will, then only your character can be tested. At the same time, whatever it is in life that you want to experience, you will know its value, you will know the pain behind it. All those things you can only know, understand, experience when you have the free will, when you really have no choice. It's just on an automatic mode. You won't really understand anything's value. And after this discussion, I think he comes to the most important point, and he shares what he thought Christians had to believe before he became a Christian, and then he clarifies that um, what his later understanding of it was. So that I thought was the heart of this book. So first, he says that he first believed that God wanted to punish men for having deserted and joined uh, joined the Satan. But then what happened was Christ volunteered to be punished instead, and so God let all of us off and forgave everybody. But then he says something interesting. He says that uh, if you read the Gospels in a deeper sense, you'll find that Christ was killed for us. His death was it has washed out all our sins, and that by dying, he disabled death itself. And I think this last statement is probably the most important one. It's a really difficult one to understand. But this is what Lewis is claiming to be Christianity, what it really is. This is what one has to be believed in order for one to be Christian. Or as he says, this is mere Christianity. He says that there are many theories that explain how Christ's death accomplished everything and all that happened. So what really is happening here is that through the example of Jesus and what he did was the perfect surrender and humiliation. He showed Christians the path that you have to go through this experience. You have to lay down your arms, surrender, apologize, and realize that that he's on the wrong path. Then only salvation can begin. Then only the true journey can begin. And if Christ can do it, and there is a way that God has shown through Christ, the others, the followers, can also try in their little ways. But I think it would be quite unfair that the book only talks about Christian belief and only teaches about this aspect of theology. I think just broadly speaking, if you want to understand theology, if you want to understand theological arguments and how human behavior can be understood in the context of religions, cultural diversities, and our own impulses, whether they are sexual impulses, or romantic impulses, or violent impulses, anything, positive or negative, whichever way you look at them. It's a good idea to read the book. You'll come up with numerous wonderful, profound arguments, and you'll learn quite a lot about theology, quite a lot about articulating your philosophical arguments. And as I said before, whether you are an atheist or a believer, it'll come handy in either case. Whichever way you want to argue, you might agree, you might not agree with certain arguments that he's making here. But rest assured, you're going to learn quite a lot from this book. So do try and read it whenever you can, and let me know about it. Let me know about what you think of C.S. Lewis's arguments. And even beyond this particular book, if you want to read C.S. Lewis, I would say go for it. He's been a wonderful writer, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. So with that, I'll take your leave, and I'll catch you with another book next time, and we'll continue on the similar theme. So catch you then.